Hey, Dr. Owens, thank you for tuning in to part 37 of our 48-part series on grace. And speaking of grace, thank you so much for being so gracious over the course of this semester with all these assignments. Very excited to be in this class. And so with that out of the way, we'll go ahead and get started. There was once a young boy named John. Now, one day, John's mother had come home and had discovered a pile of sprinkles lying on the counter. So his mother had called young John over and asked him very politely, "John, have you had any sprinkles today?" John looked at his mother with big eyes and said, "No, Mom, not me." She looked at him again and said, "John, are you certain you've had no sprinkles today?" John did his best face, thinking, No sprinkles today." John's mother stood there for a moment, looked at him one more time. "John, are you certain you haven't had any sprinkles today?" And John again looked at his mother, made his eyes as big as he could, and said, "Mother, I wouldn't even dream of getting into sprinkles while you aren't here." John's mother looked down at him, paused for a moment, and said, "Then how do you explain the sprinkles stuck all over your face?" See, the reality is this. Very often, we all end up messing up. We fail, we make mistakes, we make the wrong call. Sometimes it's small, sometimes it's big. But the truth is, failure is not a foreign concept to any of us. As human beings living in a fallen world, we are in the midst of failure constantly. Despite best laid plans, there's always a time where things just don't go according to plan. Now, that doesn't always mean it's the end of the world, but sometimes those failures lead to a lot of deep shame and disgrace, feelings that we just don't quite measure up. When I was in my senior year of high school, and the summer before that year started, I had the opportunity to go on a mission trip to Africa to do a medical relief trip. And before we had left, the missionaries had pulled us aside and kind of talked with us. This was back when everything in the Middle East was still getting very hot after 9/11. And the missionaries had explained to us that over there, it wasn't a good idea to advertise that we were Americans, that we were Christians in a crowded place. And so they told us, just don't make a scene. If you get in a conversation, that's fine, but don't draw attention to yourself. So we land in Morocco. We're waiting for our flight out to the country of Burkina Faso. And while we're there, a gentleman comes up to me in full tribal dress and asks me, "Excuse me, sir, are you a Christian?" Now, this question caught me off guard because there was nothing about my appearance or demeanor that implied that I was a Christian. He had no reason to ask that. And so I looked at him, kind of fumbling for words, and I was like, I don't quite understand what you're asking. And he looked at me very confused and said, "Sir, are you a Christian?" And I looked at him, and the only thing I could think of was that talk beforehand of don't draw attention to yourself. And I looked him in the eyes and said, No, I'm not me. Sorry." And instantly I could see he was confused as if he already knew the answer. And he looked at me for another second and said, I'm so sorry for bothering you. Please forgive me." And he walked off. Now that story has stuck with me and has impacted my life immensely over the years because of the disgrace and the shame that I felt afterwards. I mean, here I was on a mission trip and having literally just denied the name of Christ when asked by someone, how was I supposed to go and continue this trip? And upon a return, how was I supposed to continue serving? You see, grace and disgrace are all around us, waiting to be taken on. One weighs as little as a feather, the beautiful gift of grace. The other is a mantle as heavy as a mountain that we cling to so often, this weight of disgrace, this weight of shame that we refuse to let go of. It's not an easy thing because it requires admitting our failures and staring them deep dead in the eyes. And here's the truth. While each of us experience failure at some point in life and the immense shame and discouragement that accompany it, my hope tonight is to show you that every believer can experience beautiful grace in their failure by accepting 3 methods that Jesus uses to reconcile us. Now, as we dive into this, there are a lot of examples of Jesus interacting with believers and individuals, but one of the most famous, one of the most endearing is the time that he interacted with Peter after Peter's denial of him. And so we pick up our story tonight in John chapter 21. Now we're coming to the end of the gospel presentation. Jesus has already been crucified and resurrected. And background on what Peter's going through right now, leading up to Jesus' trial, Peter had actually denied knowing Christ 3 separate times. In the hours leading up to his death, he was asked by 3 different individuals, "Are you one of Jesus' disciples?" And each time he had claimed, "No, you've got the wrong guy, that's not me." And so he realizes what he's done after the 3rd time, and then Jesus is crucified, he's risen from the grave, and they have this encounter towards the end of John. Jesus is with his disciples, they're fishing, he meets them as they come to shore. And in verse 12 of John chapter 1, John the apostle writes, Jesus said to them, his disciples, come and have breakfast. Now none of the disciples dared ask him, who are you? For they knew it was the Lord. And Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and so with the fish. There's an article in the online editorial called The Atlantic discussing the importance of eating together. They had looked at a study done by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in which they tested and polled students about their home situations, whether or not they had meals with their family members, and then test them in their schools based on whether or not they were attending and how well they scored. What this organization found was that among the general population of the world, students in the age bracket of 15 years old had an average truancy rate of 15%. 15% of students that were 15 and older did not go back to school. When they separated that down into different categories, looking at their home lives, they found that under the category of students who did not enjoy regular meals with their families, the average truancy rate was doubled to 30%. And what that means is that these students who do not enjoy a regular meal with their families at home, a third of them end up going truant and dropping out from school. And there's this huge correlation between that time spent enjoying a meal and their success and their willing to engage in their school life. Now, the reason for this, I think, as we look at this and as we look at Jesus here, is not so much the food itself, but it's the intentional interaction that happens around a meal. You can't sit down with somebody and share a meal with them accidentally. You may share a bench, but you don't share the meal on accident. There is some intentionality. There's purpose behind engaging someone while you're eating food together. And just with Peter here, after Peter's denials, we see that Jesus intentionally engages him and the rest of the disciples by having breakfast with them. And so we see that this first method of Jesus was to have a meal or to have an intentional time together with Peter. Now, as this morning goes on, they enjoy their meal, and in verse 15, the apostle picks back up and says, when they, the disciples, had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? And he said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. When I was in high school, the early years of high school, I had the opportunity to go to a prom, and this was not my first date to a dance, but it was one of my early ones. And I had the opportunity to take a young lady with me. And when we got there, we were both as awkward as young teens can be. We danced a little unsure of ourselves. And as the night went on, we were both just kind of uncomfortable with our own dance capabilities. And so we sat down and I struck up conversation with her. Simple things. We were just trying to pass time until the night was done. We talked about hobbies, our family life, friends, siblings, things that we did in the summer. I came to find out a couple of weeks later as I was engaging with this young lady at school, she shared with me the immense joy that she felt at just having those conversations. She told me that it had showed her how much I valued her, not just to bring her to a dance as a pretty date and to dance with her, but to sit and share a conversation with her, learning about her, engaging her in her thoughts. As we look at Peter's interaction with Jesus right here, what we see Jesus do is this. Jesus didn't just sit and have an intentional meal with Peter. He didn't just make time to sit down and engage Peter. He sat down and actually engaged him in conversation. He asked Peter his opinion. Peter, do you love me more than these? He didn't speak at him. He asked him, Peter, share your heart with me. Do you love me more than these? See, when we're angry at someone, it's very easy to ignore them, giving them the silent treatment, turning the cold shoulder on them. It's almost a reflex in human nature. I'm going to show them how upset I am, how much they've wronged me. I'm not going to even acknowledge their presence right now. But what we see Jesus do here, where he would have been justified to completely ignore Peter, he turns in the midst of this breakfast and he begins to engage Peter in dialogue. Peter, do you love me? Do you love me more than these sheep? I know what you've done, Peter. You've denied me. Do you love me, though, Peter? Tell me from your own lips. And we see Jesus get into this very personal dialogue with Peter. Now, as far as we can tell from the text, the disciples are still there, but Jesus is kind of focusing in one-on-one with Peter this time, asking him. And so we see that Jesus has sat intentionally to eat with Peter. He's building that trust again. And not only that, he's not just associating with Peter, he is then engaging with Peter, talking with him and asking his thoughts and his heart on a matter. And as we continue with this, we see the absolute height and beauty of what Jesus does with Peter right here. And this is what happens in John chapter 21 as we continue. So Jesus asks him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter replies, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And so Jesus responds, then tend my sheep. He says again, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Good, good, feed my lambs. In verse 17, he said to him the third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter was grieved because he had said to him the third time, do you love me? And Peter said to him, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. And Jesus said to him, feed my sheep, Peter. Feed my sheep. And he continues in this dialogue right here, and as he comes to the end of verse 19, we see something really, really beautiful in Jesus' interaction with Peter. He looks at Peter, and after saying this, he said to him, follow me, Peter. And what we see is this: not only did Jesus sit and meet with Peter over breakfast, not only did Jesus then engage Peter in conversation, asking him questions, hearing his heart, hearing his thoughts, Jesus then affirmed Peter by giving him a task. Now, one of the best ways of seeing that someone trusts us is when they entrust us with a task. When they bring us into their life, their story, their mission, whatever it is they're doing, and they give us a piece of it to own and to carry out. That's not easy, because what happens is they are risking us failing at that. We see all the time around us micromanagers and people that just can't handle letting go of something, holding it because they're afraid, what if they can't do it well enough? Certainly Jesus could do it better than anyone else. And yet he looks at Peter, this man who's denied him, who's royally messed up 3 times now, not just once, but 3 times. And he looks at him and he says, Peter, follow me. Let's do this again. There's another magazine called The Guardian, and The Guardian engaged in this study of homeless individuals and their lifestyles and what it took for them to recover and get back on their feet. And as they were interviewing different homeless activists and organizations that serve to get homeless individuals into jobs and to get them into a stable life, they found this, and they wrote, getting homeless people into sustained employment is not just about putting a roof over their heads and bringing their qualifications up to date. You can give someone a house, but they're still homeless if they don't interact. And what they found was this, that while you could give a homeless individual who was down and out, who had nothing, you could give them a home. You could give them resources. But unless they had a purpose, they didn't actually rebound back into engaging with society. They stayed where they were. Yes, they had some material resources. Yes, they might be able to survive in a non-homeless environment for a period of time. But what they found was that ultimately, these individuals would lapse, or at the very least would seclude themselves, from society. There was a piece that was missing. Not just the material needs, but there was this desire inside of them, a need to be needed, to have something to do, to be affirmed as a contributing individual. There was once a young boy who, as he was growing up, his dad came to him one morning and said, son, today we're going to start a new trend here at the house. You're going to have a very important task. Your task is this: every Saturday, I want you to go around the house, and after I've mowed the yard, I need you to go around the edge of the house, around the edge of the trees, and I need you to pluck all of the weeds that are still standing. And the father looked at his son and said, son, this job is very, very important. If you don't get rid of these weeds, they will continue to grow and choke out the grass around the edge of the house, and that grass will die. And my lawnmower can't get close enough to the house to cut that, so I need you to be the one who will go and rip up these chunks of grass, these chunks of weeds. He said, son, I'm counting on you every Saturday to do this. And so the young boy looked excitedly, yes, Father, you can trust me. And that first Saturday came, the young boy got up and he ran outside after breakfast, and his father just completed mowing their yard, and he went around the house and spent a good 30 minutes pulling out weed after weed after weed after weed and making a pile of them in a bag. And he'd go and take that bag to his father. Look, Father, I gathered all the weeds, and he threw the bag in the trash. And his father looked at him and said, good job, son. Next Saturday, don't forget It's very important you get those weeds. So week after week, this little boy would wake up on Saturdays and eat his breakfast and watch some cartoons and go outside afterwards as soon as his father was done mowing the yard. And he would begin again to pull these weeds out. Now, about a month or so into this, he went to school one day and they had an individual that was speaking at their classroom about the importance of continuing education, working hard in class to be able to go to college to get a good job so that they could be important. And the individual was talking very fast and very excitedly about all the perks of going to college and how they can have an important job one day, wear a suit and tie, have people recognize them, have their name on a door. And this individual looked at the young boy and he said, "Son, wouldn't you like to go to college so you can be important?" And the little boy looked at the man in his class and said, "No, sir, not at all." And this guest speaker was caught off guard and looked at him and said, "Well, why not, son? Don't you want to be important?" And the little boy looked at the guest speaker and turned his head and said, "I'm already important, sir. I'm the CEO of weed killing at our house." And so what we see was that this little boy, while his task was not grand in the scheme of the universe, he had been brought into an actual purpose, taking care of their house. And his father had placed on him the weight of his responsibility. He had brought him in and told him, "I am entrusting you with a task that's important to me." And because he was brought in and given this task, this young boy suddenly had an immense sense of self-worth because he was doing something. And it was something that was important to someone he looked up to, something that was of value. And because the task was of value and it was entrusted to him, the young boy then felt as if he was valued. As we look at Jesus' interaction with Peter right here, Jesus has sat and he's met with Peter. He's been willing to bridge that gap. "I'm going to associate with you again, Peter." And not only that, Jesus doesn't sit with Peter and turn the cold shoulder to him. He then engages him in conversation, striking up that small talk. In this case, not very small, as he asks Peter, "Do you actually love me, your risen Lord and Savior?" But Jesus doesn't stop there, for we see his third method of reconciling Peter was that he affirmed Peter and gave him a task. He looked at Peter in the midst of his failure, in the midst of his falling short, in the midst of his screw-ups and mess-ups, and he said, "Peter, follow me. Once more, follow me, Peter. Yes, you've messed up. Yes, you've gotten it wrong. Yes, I get that. Peter, I have a job for you, though. I have something I want you to do. You're not going to sit off on the sides. This job is too important for you to be doing that. And I want to ask you to do it." The other disciples are there, but Jesus looks at Peter. "Peter, I have a job for you. Follow me." And we can only imagine what that must have done to Peter. To have Peter sit there and to be thinking over the past few days that he had denied his Lord and Savior and arguably probably his best friend in his greatest hour of need. Watching the other disciples celebrating as Jesus has come back to life, they're finally starting to get it. But in the back of Peter's mind is a little voice saying, "You screwed up bad." And so maybe Peter goes fishing to try and hide it, not think about it. Maybe he's hoping Jesus won't bring it up. Maybe he's hoping, if I just hang out with the group, Jesus won't bring this up in front of the others. We don't need to talk about it. I'll just, I'll deal with it later. And so often, I think as individuals, that is our mindset. When we mess up, we desperately desire grace, but we are absolutely afraid to look our failure dead in the eye and acknowledge it for what it might say about us. We bury it down, we conceal it, we ignore it. And in so doing, we put on that mantle of the mountain of disgrace. We carry it with us for days, weeks, months, years, because heaven forbid somebody might see it. And yet when Jesus saw Peter's, and Jesus ate with Peter, and Jesus spoke with Peter, and Jesus affirmed Peter, we see Peter's whole story begin to turn around. 3 times Peter denied Jesus. 3 times Jesus asked Peter, "Peter, do you love me? Good. I have a job for you." A beautiful reversal. And yes, hearing these words doesn't necessarily make it easier to acknowledge our failure, to look it in the eyes, to lay it forth and seek grace. That takes incredible courage and vulnerability. Vulnerability. But what we do see is this. No matter where we come from, where we're at in life, every single one of us fails from time to time. Some small, some massive. Some affect just us, some affect countless others. And when in the midst of all of that failure, inevitably our worth comes into question. Is that failure so big that that is who I am now? I am that failure. I am that moment. I am that shortcoming. Certainly, God himself wants nothing to do with that failure. God's in the business of saving souls. Why would God want anything to do with this failure? And suddenly the failure becomes less of an action in a moment and more of an identity. But my hope again tonight is that going through this, you might see that each of us can experience the beautiful feather of grace resting on our shoulders by simply accepting these three methods that Jesus used to reconcile Peter. Because I think in the same way that Jesus reconciled Peter, Jesus is willing to reconcile us. But we have to understand it is accepting these three methods because it requires us to acknowledge that failure, the failure that needs the grace. The first step in receiving grace and feeling that grace is being willing to acknowledge that there is a failure that needs it. I opened with that story of getting to go to Morocco and Burkina Faso and take these medicines, these individuals out there and share the gospel with them. And at the beginning, I royally messed up. I mean, modern day Peter here. Do you know Jesus? No, I don't know him. Not me. And the truth is, for years, I wrestled with that. I served in my church as best I could. I engaged with students, and I told them Jesus loved them, Jesus believed in them, Jesus was willing to forgive them, Jesus wanted to be gracious with them, Jesus had a place for them, but not for me, he didn't. Because let's be honest, there are some things that cross that line where Jesus is like, not that. That's too much. That's too much. You sit over there. Yeah, my blood's enough. You're saved, but I'm not touching that right now. I've got better things to do. I can't handle that level of failure. And for years, I felt Jesus saying that to me, Foster. I love you, but not today. We're not engaging in this today. I'll see you one day when you die, but I'm going to use someone else. And it took me quite some time to be able to look my failure in the eyes, to stare it down, to look it over every angle, see how ugly it was, see how selfish it was, see how cowardly it was. Yes, to acknowledge those things about myself and to lay it there and then to begin let Jesus meet with me. No longer was there this defense of, no, Jesus, don't look at me. You can't. Nope, don't talk to me. Nope, don't engage with me. Laying that disgrace down, suddenly I was willing to let Jesus sit with me and share a meal with me in a sense. I was willing to let Jesus talk to me, to ask me questions, to share his heart with me. And ultimately, I was willing to let Jesus give me a job and affirm my worth, that he still had a place for me, that he wanted me in his story, that I wasn't just an inconvenience or something that he needed to sit on the side. I wasn't a child in a china shop that needed to be put in the corner so I didn't break something. That yes, I might break stuff, but Jesus wanted me right in the middle with him enjoying it. And that was when I finally began to feel the beautiful weight of that feather of grace. And so as we go throughout this week, I don't know what challenges you might be facing. I don't know what's on your heart. I don't know all the details of your life. But my challenge is this. If you're like any other human being I've ever met, including myself, there are areas where you've failed. And this week, each day, I want you to take 15 minutes. I want you to take one of those areas. Maybe it's the biggest one right now. Maybe it's something that you refuse to talk to anyone else about. You are utterly ashamed that it might ever come to light. Most importantly, that it would ever come to light before God. But my encouragement is this, that you would take 15 minutes and you would take whatever that disgrace is, that you would acknowledge it and stare it in the face, that you would acknowledge that you fell short as much as that hurts. You would acknowledge that you messed up, that you made a wrong choice, And that in that acknowledgement, while you were doing that, you would make a list of different ways that you've seen God interacting with your story over the past week. Because I think one of the biggest mindsets we get when that happens is we think that once I've engaged in this much disgrace, once I'm steeped in this mountain of disgrace, Jesus wants nothing to do with me. He's done with me. He's ignoring me. He's not doing anything. And so to go against that, I want you to write down during these 15 minutes a list of the different ways that you've seen God's grace in your life, that you've seen his provision, that you've seen opportunities for growth, for blessing, the ways that you've seen, maybe you haven't even acknowledged it until this moment, but ways that God has been right there in your story. Ways that maybe he's been looking for you to sit down and have a meal with you. Ways that he's been wanting just to talk with you, to ask you what your thoughts are, how your day's going, where your heart's at. In ways that maybe he's been trying to get your attention, to pull you in, to show you a task that he has for you. A way that he wants to engage you and have you engaged in his story. I know that's not easy, and I know it takes a lot of strength and courage to be able to stare our failures down in the face like that. But my hope is that by doing so, and holding to these three methods, that Jesus wants to meet and eat with us, that Jesus wants to speak with us, and that Jesus wants to affirm us, that you would begin feeling the grace and the affirmation that Jesus has. Let's go ahead and pray. Father, thank you so much for this week. I pray that you would help us to be obedient to you in the moments that we are not obedient. I pray that you would pour out grace. Lord, I pray that you help us to be courageous this week, that in the moments of our lives where we have messed up, that you begin calling those to light, that we would acknowledge them before you for what they are. Lord, that we would not stay buried under that mountain of disgrace and shame, but that we'd lay these before you, Lord, and that you would begin to engage us as you engaged Peter. That you would meet with us as if to have a meal, that you would speak to us one-on-one, Lord, sharing your heart with us and asking what is on our heart. And that, Lord, in the course of this, that you would affirm us and show us that you have a place for us in your story, that you want to do something with us. Lord, I love you so much. I thank you for the grace that you have when we fail, and I pray that you continue to show us more of just how much you love us. All these things we pray in your name. Amen. Awesome. Thanks for listening.